You all for joining this webinar. This is a part of the Center for Transportation and Logistics at IIM Ahmedabad. We host very distinguished speakers with some very contemporary topics. As you would realize, it has been decades that supply chain has become quite global. But having said that, we paid very little attention on the diversity, inclusion part of the whole and the equity part of the whole story. So we are very fortunate to have with us today Doy. Doy is an assistant professor of business administration at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. He teaches operations management for the core MBA and also teaches elective on strategic sourcing. Prior to Darden, he earned his PhD from the Carlson School at the University of Minnesota. And the best part is that Doy is doing several studies in socially responsible supply chains and operations. And particularly, he is examining the issues of diversity and inclusion in operations and supply chain management. This topic is very new to us. We have hardly focused on this part of the supply chain. We have been always on the front end and talking about profitability, a bit of sustainability, but somehow the social responsible fabric has been missing in our conversations. Doy's work is deeply rooted in his personal experiences from where he belonged to. His home country is India as well, and today he's in US. His background has resulted in several interesting research. He studied the supply diversity initiatives in public procurement settings. He analyzed the influence of inclusive leadership on supply chain outcomes. These are very crucial topics for us. He has also looked at several interdisciplinary work. His work is also at the interface of human resources, public policy, operations. So that brings a very interesting flavor to his conversations as well. And he has also been very well successful in publishing some of this important work in really reputed journals like MSOM, POM, data policy, and also practitioner outlets like HBR. So I think we are very fortunate to bring him on board today for the CTL webinar. And without much delay, I would like to give the floor rather than Zoom to Doy. Doy, this all Zoom is yours. And please go ahead. Yes. And I'll be happy to moderate this webinar. If you have questions, please put them in chat box. And if it requires immediate attention, I'll bring it to attention for everybody.
Fantastic. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Devjit, thank you so much for the invite and thank you for this glowing introduction. I actually have a couple of introduction slides in the beginning, so some of the contents are going to be a little repetitive, so excuse me for that. So let me share my screen. I do have a few slides that will, guide our conversation today. So can you all see my slides in full screen? Okay, great. So it's my extreme honor and pleasure to be here, to be invited and talk about something that's very close to my heart, towards advancing DEI in operations and supply chain management. I'm Doipayan Roy. I go by Dwai or Roy, and I'm at the Darden Graduate School of Business at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So a little bit about myself, I have an MBA from IIT Madras. Of course, my CAT scores were not high enough to get into IIM Ahmedabad, so I ended up going to IIT Madras. After my MBA, I worked with the Royal Bank of Scotland for about 3 years, where I implemented a bunch of technology projects that helped to improve the customer experience of RBS, and I also trained more than 300 executives and managers on different Lean Six Sigma tools. And I always knew, I wanted to do a PhD. I wanted to become a professor. I loved the university environment. And, from RBS, I ended up going to cold Minneapolis, the Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota. I still remember used to get the first snowfall in November, and then we did not see the ground until April and sometimes even May. So that was like a drastic change for me. And from Minnesota, I moved to Virginia, southern US, very different weather, very different people, very different food. And here, at Darden, I teach the first year MBA course on operations management and the second year MBA elective on strategic sourcing. And here are some pictures from the best part of my job, my students, both inside and outside the classroom. All right, so that's a little bit about me. So as a student, I never learned a lot when there was a monologue, when there was a lecture from the faculty, from the professor. I always learned more when there were conversations, when there were discussions. So in the next 1 hour, I would definitely seek input from the 45 odd participants who have joined us. So why don't we start with some numbers? So I'm going to put up some numbers, and our audience is going to help us understand what do these numbers mean. Hint, look at the sources. That should give you a hint about what these numbers mean. What do you think 52% and 48% mean? Look at the sources. Look at the sources. Are there any hands? I do see one hand up. I see Saurabh Garg. Okay. Now, he put his hand down. What is 42% and 52%? 48% and 52% mean? Anybody? All right, let me give this away. So what this means, so 42% is the proportion of India's population that identifies as male, and 48% is the proportion of India's population that identifies as female. The next set of numbers, I need the answers from the audience. What does 86% and 14% mean? What is 86% and 14? Okay, Sunil Tiwari, yes. Can you unmute yourself? Or can you put the answers in the chat?
Also, there's Karina, if you want to answer.
Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, probably I can then take a stab at it. Probably it is a representation workforce, right? Or something around that, or
it's something that happened very recently in our country. The mark is still here. I was in India when the elections happened. I casted my vote. So these are the proportion of male parliamentarians and female parliamentarians in Lok Sabha. And finally, these numbers were like drastic, like the difference was drastic to, at least for me. What this represents is the number of small businesses that are owned by men and the number of small businesses proportion of small businesses that are female. So what does this tell you? Like, men and women, they comprise almost equal proportions of India's population. But when it comes to leadership roles, you see some kind of disparity. And when you see, small business ownership, the disparities are even larger. And in the context of US, if you look at the proportion of US population that identifies as white and that identifies as black, it's about 75 and 14%. But if you look at the number of firms that are owned by white individuals and that are black individuals, the disparities are drastic. So, these numbers, they tell a story, and I always like to start any conversation around DEI with these numbers. All right, so, these numbers, they bothered me. Because they bother me, in my research, what I'm studying is socially responsible operations. And within this broader context of socially responsible operations, what I'm most passionate about is the topic of D&I in operations and supply chain management. And the bulk of my research, the bulk of my teaching activities, they revolve around this central question. How can supply chains be more community focused, particularly of those from historically marginalized communities? And this motivation to look at D&I within operations, within supply chain management, it comes from my own unique lived experiences. Growing up in different parts of India, I was born in Mumbai, I lived in Bihar, down south in Karnataka, then Kurukshetra, then Chennai. Then I moved to Minnesota and now here in southern US. Very different geographies, very different culture, people. And more recently, as you can see from these, news headlines, organizations like Forbes, Deloitte, they are advocating the need for designing and sustaining more diverse and inclusive supply chains. And diverse and inclusive supply, if you look at these articles, what they highlight is diverse and inclusive supply chains, they're more competitive. They're able to unlock more innovation, and they provide access to new markets and deliver socioeconomic impact in the local operating market. Now, what is diverse and inclusive supply chains? In the next 45 minutes or so, I'll try to explain diverse and inclusive supply chains. Why do we need them? Through some examples from my own research. So one stream of my research, it focuses on supplier diversity initiatives, in US public procurement. So what is public procurement? Public procurement, it represents the purchase of goods, services, and construction by a public authority or a government agency. And public procurement, as you can see from this graph, it constitutes around 10 to 20% of a country's GDP. And because of the significant monetary investments that go into public procurement, it is often used as a tool by the government to fulfill, let's say, election mandates or public policy objectives. And in the US, if you just add up these numbers, so civilian agencies are non-defense agencies, and defense agency is nothing but the Department of Defense. If you add up these numbers, what you will find is the US federal government, it spends close to $637 billion each year in procuring goods and services from external buyers. So given this significant amount of monetary investment, there are certain legislative provisions in federal procurement that encourages the participation of businesses that are owned by specific demographic groups. In the US, this may be, businesses that are owned by women, businesses that are owned and operated by minority individuals. Just for clarification, in the US, minority individuals refer to a socially disadvantaged individual. A socially disadvantaged individual primarily comes from a racial minority group, for example, Blacks or Hispanics, and in some cases, Asians as well. So there are legislative provisions also to encourage the participation of businesses that are located in economically disadvantaged regions, and also specific firm types like small business. Now, nearly 43% of the countries worldwide, they have some kind of legislative provisions that encourages the participation of small businesses in public procurement. So why this focus on small businesses? As you can see, small businesses are the growth engines of the US economy. They are even growth engines of the Indian economy, and they create nearly 2/3 of net new jobs and drive US innovation and competitiveness. And there is untapped potential with small businesses. Many times when I talk to private organizations, to federal contracting officers, what they mention is small businesses are very nimble. They are very flexible, and once you give them an opportunity, they will prove themselves. There is very less overhead when you work with small businesses. It is very intuitive. So given the crucial role of small businesses in the US economy, the federal government has established something called the set-aside program, wherein there is a mandate to award at least 23% of annual federal contracting dollars exclusively to small businesses. Now, if you go back to one of the previous slides, the US federal government awards around $600 billion, of which at least one-fourth approximately needs to go to small businesses. So it's a huge chunk of money. It's $150 billion. And you multiply that with 80, you see how much of the investment happens in, let's say, Indian rupees. And the reason to set aside these contracts is to encourage the participation of small businesses in the federal contracting process. So, what we were interested to look at, in one of my studies is, does the performance of contracts awarded through set-aside policy differ from those awarded through open competition? And if so, in what way? And how do characteristics of the contracting environment, specifically contractor firm experience and the timing of awarding a contract, interact with the contract set-aside status to affect contract performance? And again, the motivation to look at these two questions was, derived from some of our intuition that whenever we talk about diversity, whenever we talk about inclusion, whenever we talk about affirmative action or reservations, to uplift certain marginalized communities, there's always this trade-off that, there's this conception that if we have reservations, if we have affirmative action, we're going to compromise with performance. But if this expectation, is this intuition backed up by empirical evidence? We did not find so in the literature, and that's when we started looking at this question. So, without getting into too much of details, I would just like to talk quickly about the key findings. So what we find is set-aside contracts, they perform better. So set-aside contracts are those contracts that are awarded by limiting competition to just small businesses. For us, this result was kind of surprising. And, when we went out, when we spoke to the federal contracting officers, what they told us was when you limit competition to just small businesses, they feel more confident ex ante to win a contract because, the big names like Amazon, like Best Buy, or, in India's context, like the Flipkart or Reliance are not going to participate in that because it's just limited to small businesses. And because of this increased competition, the federal officers, they have more options to choose from and award a contract, and that translates into better contract performance. We also found that, the set-aside contracts, they perform better with higher levels of different agency experience. So the federal government, it has like different agencies, like, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Defense, and so on. And what we expect is that the performance of set-aside contracts are better with more different agency experience because you're able to accumulate knowledge from diverse sources. Sometimes when you are doing the same work, you get bored of it, but when you do something different, your performance improves. And also, set-aside contracts that are awarded early in a fiscal year, they perform better because at the beginning of the fiscal year or beginning of the financial year, there is less workload. And it helps contracting officers to invest more time, more efforts in the contractor selection process, translating into better performance. So, in this study, I looked at one aspect of diversity, the size of the business. But what is also interesting is that many of these businesses, they are owned and operated by women, owned and operated by minority individuals. Again, going back to that same slide, $637 billion being awarded each year as contracts to external businesses by the federal government. But how do you think this distribution looks with women and minority-owned businesses? So I'll just give a moment to go through these numbers. So if you look at women-owned and operated businesses, nearly 20% of the businesses in the US economy is owned and operated by women. But if you look at the proportion of contracts that are awarded of these 637 billion, it's only 4%. And if you look at minority-owned businesses, again, they constitute around 20% of the US economy, and the contracts that are awarded is just 10%. So again, huge disparities in terms of the presence of women-owned, minority-owned businesses in the US economy and the proportion of contracts that are awarded to these businesses. So, given these numbers, I'll just talk a little bit about, the data collection here, which can help some of our researchers who have joined, this talk. So we collected data from this website called uscspending.gov. We had a data set of 1.5 million contracts awarded by 58 different agencies from 2019 to 2021. And, we pulled data from a bunch of other sources like, Bureau of Labor Statistics, MIT Election Data Science Lab, and American Community Survey. And we also, conducted interviews with executive directors of small business procurement at 4 different federal agencies: Health and Human Services, Veteran Affairs, NASA, and HUD. HUD is Housing and Urban Development. NASA is something very similar to ISRO that we have in India. And Veteran Affairs is veterans, who have worked in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, but are now getting back into the civilian workforce. So what we found was, these minority-owned businesses, they are owned and operated by racial minorities. And sometimes there's this tendency to club all minority-owned businesses into a single category. But what we found was there were racial disparities, like you saw, like 20% of the businesses are owned and operated by minority-owned individuals, but only 10% of the contracts are awarded to them. Racial disparities are prevalent, but they are majorly being driven by Black-owned and Hispanic-owned businesses. And these disparities are more in contracts that have high STEM intensity. So what is STEM? STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So in contracts that involve more STEM-related work, Black-owned businesses and Hispanic-owned businesses are particularly underrepresented. And a key policy implication of our study was that folks need to move away from the tendency to bundle different types of minority-owned businesses under a single category. And some of the findings from this study we translated into a practitioner article with in Harvard Business Review. Feel free to pick up a copy and go through it if this topic intrigues you, interests you. So this was in the context of U.S. public procurement, the topic of supplier diversity. Now, what does it mean for India? What does it mean in the context of procurement in India? So I was thinking about it, and for us to think about, for us to develop, let's say, a research agenda, a research program that looks at supplier diversity in the context of India. First of all, diversity itself is very diverse. Just like we saw, there is women-owned business, minority-owned business. There are businesses that are located in economically disadvantaged regions. There are LGBTQ-owned and operated businesses. So, in the context of India, what would supplier diversity mean for the government of India, for government of Gujarat? How would, governments define supplier diversity? And what unique capabilities can diverse suppliers provide to the government? And what challenges do you foresee in encouraging the inclusion of diverse suppliers in public sector supply chain? Now, why don't we take a minute, think about these 3 questions, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts on how do you think we could define supply diversity in the context of India, the capabilities and the challenges. Okay, chat is visible. Okay, that's fine. Just take a look at these questions. Just think about it, and okay, there's response in Q&A. All right. So this was supplier diversity in the context of public procurement. What about private sector companies? So, very recently, HUL and Genpact, they launched a supplier diversity initiative called BC. Now, this is an accelerator program that enables minority businesses to be absorbed into the supply chains of large consumer good companies like HUL. And it has been implemented by Satwa. I don't know how many of you have heard about this organization. It's a leading social impact research and advisory firm. And it's a program that provides a host of activities to minority-owned businesses in India. For example, mentorship, access to networks, providing knowledge, resources. And how do they define minority-owned businesses? There were 4 categories. Businesses that are owned and operated by persons with disabilities, member of a scheduled caste or tribe, and individuals from transgender community. And like you see in the words of the procurement director with HUL, this initiative seeks to create opportunities for diverse and underrepresented business to grow and become supply chain ready. Diversity in supply chains is a competitive advantage for any business, and it widens economic and social impact. And in the previous two studies, I tried to provide a flavor of how can we measure, how can we provide more empirical evidence about how diversity in supply chains can offer economic, it can offer social impact for buyer organizations. So, one stream of my research, again, going back to the broader theme of diverse and inclusive supply chains, one stream of my research, it looks at, supplier diversity initiatives in supply chains and procurement. And another stream of my research, it looks at, what is the impact of inclusive leadership in mitigating health disparity? And, this particular paper, I'm, specifically proud of it because Amir and I, we were in the same graduate program. He was 1 year ahead of me, and some of the initial thoughts about this paper, it emerged from our lunch discussion. So, it just got accepted this year. So I would like to talk a little bit about this paper, but before doing that, I would also like to highlight this paper where we look at the impact of diversity in decision makers, particularly, how do young directors influence the provision of, let's say, health benefits, employment non-discrimination laws for LGBTQ individuals, a topic that has not been studied much, at least in the operations and supply chain management literature. So, going back to this paper, Procurement for Empowerment, the impact of female decision makers in reproductive health supply chain. So contraceptives, they are an essential reproductive health commodity, and as an essential reproductive health commodity, they help women to prevent unwanted and closely spaced pregnancies, reduce maternal mortalities, and its associated adverse consequences like psychological distress and unfulfilled career aspirations. In other words, contraceptives, they empower women to take better care of their physical and mental health. However, access to contraceptives, it remains limited in low and middle income countries. For example, in low and middle income countries where 80% of the global population lives, nearly 900 million women of reproductive age, they want to avoid a pregnancy. But around 200 million, or 1/4 of them, they have an unmet need for contraception. That is, they are unable to access contraceptives at a facility when they want to. And this lack of access to contraceptives, it's driven by both supply side as well as demand side factors. And what you see here is a supply chain, a visual representation of a supply chain to procure and distribute contraceptives. And this figure, it does no justice to the amount of time that we spent, talking to folks at USAID, including, a former health minister of a West African country, trying to understand how are contraceptives procured and distributed through public health supply chains. Let me go over this diagram, step by step. So what we learned was that in low and middle income countries, national governments, particularly the health ministers, plays a crucial role in facilitating the procurement of contraceptives. So the health minister leads initiatives to understand how many units of contraceptives are needed, what types of contraceptives are needed. The health minister provides relevant resources like forecasting tools, training of manpower to ensure that the demand for contraceptives, the quantities of contraceptives that are required are forecasted correctly. And parliamentarians, they have the potential to support these efforts of health ministers to understand how much procurement is needed, to quantify the quantity of contraceptives by giving floor speeches in parliaments or by talking to constituents and understanding what are their needs when it comes to reproductive health, when it comes to family planning. And, during our conversations, what we learned was governments and Ministry of Health in particular, they lead the quantification process for contraceptives. What does quantification mean? Quantification means how much contraceptives are needed and what type of contraceptives are needed by a country over a period of time. And requirements for contraceptives come to the procuring organization. Now, you could also call them international development organizations, but we call it procuring organizations because in the context of public health supply chains, they are helping to facilitate the procurement of contraceptives. Some of the examples of procuring organizations are USAID, UNFPA, United Nations Family Planning Association, IPPS, International Planned Parenthood Foundation. So what these organizations do is they collect the requirements of contraceptives from national governments of different countries and they pass it on to the manufacturers or the suppliers. And this procurement model is called the pooled procurement model, and it helps the governments of low and middle income countries to save on overhead costs, and it also helps in terms of getting quantity discounts because you are aggregating the quantities of contraceptives that are needed from different countries and then passing them on to the suppliers. So this was a supply chain talk. Where does diversity and inclusion come here? So what we also learned was that countries are better at mobilizing resources for contraceptive procurement if there are women in government. And this discussion quote was also rooted in a seminal work by Chattopadhyay and Duflo. Duflo is Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years back in economics. What they find, and this study was in the state of West Bengal, if I recall correctly. What they found was that female decision makers, they tend to prioritize issues in ways that seem to better reflect women's needs and preferences. Right? So if you have women in government, they are creating an enabling environment for the procurement of contraceptives. However, women are severely underrepresented in national government. For example, 21% of cabinet ministers are women. These are all at the national level in low and middle income countries, and 26% of parliamentarians are women. So what is the consequence of this underrepresentation? So it's women who are most profoundly affected by limited access to family planning, reproductive health services, yet they continue to have very little influence in shaping family planning, in shaping reproductive health policy. So, given this motivation, what we looked at is, does the increased representation of female decision makers in national government in low and middle income countries, do they impact contraceptive procurement, and in what way? So this was a very simple study, like, two hypothesis study. In our first hypothesis, we proposed that a female health minister is associated with an increase in the procurement quantity of contraceptives in comparison to a male health minister. Now, why do we think this may hold true? It's women who die from childbirth. It's women who, may have to undergo an abortion. And in other words, it's women who suffer the adverse consequences of a lack of access to contraceptives. They are disproportionately impacted. But at the same time, if you go back to those numbers, 21%, 26%, women are underrepresented, and they may not have the necessary capacity, the necessary voice to bring about changes in a male-dominated environment. So this hypothesis is not that straightforward. So in hypothesis 2, we propose that this positive association between female health minister and procurement quantity of contraceptives, it becomes stronger when there is an increase in the proportion of female parliamentarians. So what happens is, what we are expecting is, if there are more women parliamentarians, there are more like-minded allies who are also aware of the issues of a lack of access to contraceptives. And together, a woman health minister So, and women parliamentarians, they can bring about changes to the reproductive health policies, to the family planning situation in a country. So again, without going into too much of the data collection, the data analysis, some of our findings were quite revealing. So what we find is, compared to a male health minister, a female health minister is associated with an average 66% increase in the procurement quantity of contraceptives. That's a huge figure. And when there is a female health minister, a 10% increase in the proportion of female parliamentarians is associated with an average 6% increase in the procurement quantity of contraceptives. And in this figure, what you see is, in the presence of a female health minister, when the proportion of female parliamentarians increases, the increase in the procurement quantity of contraceptives is higher in comparison to a situation when there is a male health minister. So I first started the study with procurement and supply chains, and then slowly integrated diversity, inclusion, inclusive leadership on this public health supply chain. So what are the implications from our study findings? Some of us here are operations management, supply chain management scholars, and the reason why we self-selected into this stream is because we probably like to work with numbers, right? And much of our research, that has looked at the supply-related challenges, they have looked at, let's say, product assortment, they have looked at, inventory modeling, and which is great in its rightful way, but I think we also need to look at the human factors that influence these decisions. And in our paper, we show that the female decision makers matter, specifically for contraceptive procurement in public health supply chain. And it's also important for us operations management scholars to also consider the subjective aspects that influence procurement decisions. It's important to pay attention to who are the decision makers. And if I'm not wrong, in October 2023, I think India also became one of the few countries that have reservations for women in national parliament, which is a good step forward, to increase the representation of, women decision makers. And finally, we contribute to research that integrates diversity and inclusion with OM, and we focus on the specific opportunities, challenges, and perspectives of women in LMS. So, the first half of the presentation, we talked about US, public procurement. Here we look at, in this study, we looked at low and middle income countries as an aggregate. So what does this mean, for India? What are some of the, research streams that we could look at the intersection of diversity and inclusion and operations and supply chain management in the context of India? And I would like to leave us, with this, news article. It just appeared. This is a July 3rd news article. As you can see, international brands, they are limiting their dependency on China by shifting some manufacturing to India. And this trend holds the potential to generate significant numbers of manufacturing jobs, especially for women who have largely been excluded from the ranks of formal Indian employment. And to me, this quote was particularly interesting. Some parts of the job, so this is in the context of manufacturing again, and it's a snippet from this article, like some parts of the job women are better at. Women can concentrate for longer hours than men. They don't need as many smoke breaks or breaks in general, and women are definitely more hardworking and productive, than men. And this was by the chief of staff of a manufacturing startup. This company manufactures toys. However, another news article also appeared a couple of, a few weeks back. Apple supplier Fox, I don't know how many of you have seen this. Apple supplier Foxconn set to reject married women from India iPhone jobs. So, as scholars, as practitioners, one thing for us to think about is how do we make sure that, headlines like this appear more and headlines like this do not appear at all in an ideal scenario. So, with that, I think we have time for Q&A, so I would love to open the floor up for discussion. And if you have any questions, any concerns, any clarifications, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Zoe, for this fascinating discussions and the questions that you open up. Let us see if our participants have any thoughts on this. But Zoe, what do you think are, right now, of course, I have one thought, which is, this is a very popular, or rather a very neglected area, right? Nobody has been thinking much on inclusion. But do you think any organization, you mentioned a few who are proactively thinking about it, like the parliament and all, but does it also kind of work antithesis of meritocracy in general? So, of course, there's a tension, right? We would like some schools because they're all merit-based, but we also like schools which are more reservation-based. So there's two sides of the coin. And how does one act against each other? Because I would suspect that when you talk about supply chain, some of the key roles are very, very niche, and there are very few positions like this. And you would like the best person to come over there. In such a scenario, there's always a tension, right? Do you want the best person, or do you want a diverse person? This is always a tension. Or any thoughts, and if you know some kind of work going on in that area?
So no, this is a question that always comes up when we talk about diversity and inclusion. And for example, in the paper on women parliamentarians, women health minister, and contraceptive access, I did not get into much about the empirics, but we look at like quotas, and the quotas are influencing the women parliamentarians. So there are two kinds there are two channels through which folks can get elected, either competitively or through reservation. And there is an economics professor, Lakshmi Iyer. She is in University of Notre Dame, and she has done phenomenal work in the context of India, showing that how representation of women, it matters. For example, she has a paper which shows that when you have more women sarpanches or sarpanch in India, the crime rates go up in the villages, which is kind of surprising. Crime rates against women go up in the villages. But if you read the paper a little bit into detail, what she and her co-authors show is that the number of crimes that are reported, that goes up. So it's not the crime rates against women that is going up, but the crime rates that are reported against women that are going up. So that would be, there is Lakshmi, there's also Sonia Bhalotra. So they have done phenomenal work in this on this topic. But going back to your question, first and foremost, that's why I like to start it with numbers. 52% men, 48% women. So as and 94% men-owned businesses, just 6% women-owned businesses. Why this discrepancy? There are so much, social barriers, which, women in the context of, U.S. minority individuals have to encounter. So as the first step, reservation may be the way to go, as it can help to break those social barriers and have more equity in the selection process and the representation process. And if we go back to the first study, where we look at the performance of, businesses that have entered through limited competition versus open competition, what we show is that businesses that have entered through limited competition, they are actually performing better. So, reservation or, preference programs to certain categories that may not necessarily compromise performance. So one thought for us to think about is, give them a chance, they will shine.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I'm just thinking about the depth of diversity and inclusion we have to think about. So as you think about organization, the pyramid, right? So probably at least have certain depth, for example, maybe the bottom tier or 2-3 tiers where there's enough opportunities. Maybe there we include more of reservations or opportunity based, and maybe where there is become narrower, we get into more competitive, so that the more balance of you have merit as well as equity. And eventually, if you give a kind of opportunity, hopefully they will rise up and they will take up. So it might be interesting to see the depth of the DEI that organization needs. So it could be a balance between these two. So I'm sure a lot of work might be going on in this area. Yeah, just that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Any other thoughts? There are maybe a few other questions here. Yes, I see here. So let us go through them. There is a question: MSMEs in India lack adequate financing, while supplier diversity is a concept may benefit the US. When it comes to India, how do you tackle structural financing issues which impede contract obligation fulfillment, adherence to diverse, and hence diverse supplier?
And hence supplier diversity. I think that's a great question. And, the economics people, they have done a lot of work on how, for the same set of qualifications, let's say, there is a white applicant and there is an African-American applicant, for the same set of qualifications, the likelihood that an African-American applicant gets denied a loan is higher. So financing issues are, prevalent. So again, going back to that question about if, preferential treatment helps or not, from the bank's perspective, if the bank, loan officers know that, there are preference programs in place and, this particular individual may be able to win a contract because of that, preference program, the likelihood that the loan is issued to this individual, that increases, which is probably not the right way to go in an ideal scenario, because we all should get, what we deserve on the basis of our merit. But unfortunately, our societal structure is not structured in that way. And that's why, at least for a starting step, we do need some of these reservations, some of these preference programs. And now we're trying to show that, reservations did not necessarily mean compromise performance. So yes, adequate financing, definitely. That's a big issue. Yeah.
There's a follow-up, a similar question. In Indian context, we observe that supplier regional ethnic similarity with that of buyer firm owners, which is kind of an antithesis of supplier diversity. Any thoughts whether this can be taken an empirical research study? Yeah, I think what he's saying is that a lot of suppliers have regional ethnic similarity with that of buyer firm owners, which is a kind of antithesis of supplier diversity.
So I don't think I understand what is regional ethnic similarity.
I think it is more of they're focused in one particular region, like you can think about.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think this is a great point, and I'm actually working on a paper that looks at how government, particularly the federal government, can promote the participation of businesses that are located in economically disadvantaged regions. So the reason I bring this up, last year when I was in my classroom, I was talking about all these, supply diversity initiatives in African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and a French student, he raises his hand and he's like, in France, this is illegal. We cannot give reservation on the basis of race. I was like, then how do you operationalize supply diversity in your country? Do you even have the concept of supply diversity? He was like, no. And then there was an Italian student, he raised his hand. He was like, in Italy, certain regions of Italy are less developed than certain other regions. And I think, if I recall correctly, he said that the southern region, the southern Italy is less developed in comparison to northern Italy. And the government of Italy, it promotes participation of businesses that are located in southern Italy over northern Italy. So there is some preference given to businesses that are operated from southern Italy. And I had two students from Paraguay, and they also mentioned that their government has certain, policies in place to encourage participation of businesses that are located in economically disadvantaged regions. And the US federal government also has a policy. I did not get into that. It's called the Historically Underutilized Business Zone Program. When we look at US, it's a vast country, and most of us just think about the coast, New York, California. But if you look at the Midwest or the southern parts of the country, the economic disparities in this country is way higher. It's like high, not way higher. It's high. And one way in which the federal government tries to correct these locational disparities is by ensuring that at least 3% of its contracting dollars are awarded to businesses that are located in these economically disadvantaged regions. And one thing that we found, over the course of our research is that the federal government has never been able to meet this 3% goal. And one particular reason is that, businesses, they just don't want to go to these, underdeveloped regions. Like in the context of India, if we see like how many businesses are, let's say, located in the northeastern part of our country. I lived in Karnataka for 8 years. And when we think about Karnataka, Bangalore, IT city hub comes up in our mind. Mangalore comes up in our mind. But there are certain underdeveloped regions as well. If I recall correctly, Bidar, Bagalkot, those regions, if you just compare their GDP per capita, it's low. And there are these disparities even within the state. So I think this is a great question. And in terms of, diversity, like again, diversity is very diverse. We looked at, race and gender, but we can, and, size of the business, but diversity can also be defined in terms of geographic diversity, in terms of regional diversity.
Yeah. I think there is a related government question is, what role does education and awareness about political processes play in influencing women's involvement in politics?
Yeah, that's a thoughtful question, and I would say yes. I mean, educate. So, staying in India, when I look at some of my friends, and this is again like 90s, 2000s, we are saving up for our daughter's marriage. Why?
Yeah.
Save up for the education. Save up for the education, and that will translate into more informed, votes and increased representation of, women. And if you go back to that study about women decision makers impacting contraceptive procurement, first when we started presenting that study, people were like, why would it matter? It's a health policy question. Why would, whether it's a man or a woman, why would it matter? So one thing that helps people to understand is that if you have a daughter will be more comfortable in discussing about reproductive health issues with her mom in comparison to her dad. And the same thing goes to constituents. A woman constituent will be more comfortable discussing about reproductive health issues probably with a women MLA, with a women MP, or with a women elected representative rather than a male representative. And even to discuss the problems, you need education, you need awareness. And so, investing in women's education, I think that's one of the priority items for all governments.
Yeah. So I think the next question is moving away from supply chain and saying that, okay, how does DEI help in financial services? We've been talking a lot of procurement. Any thoughts on financial services? I would say, if I have to say, I think it matters, right? Because as you include more people in your training, I think creativity, I think the whole world of creativity comes from this diversity. So if you're talking about financial services, if you're talking about innovative product development, or if you're talking about any kind of process innovation, I think these diversity would bring a huge deal in improvement, because there's so much of variability in these processes. And to standardize, and that may be helpful. Yeah, Doy, your thoughts?
I would say, I completely agree with what you said, David, but another point that I would just like to add in here is, if you look at the correlation between, let's say, the income and marginalized communities, they're going to be correlated. even in the US, whites, they earn more on an average than blacks or Hispanics. So in terms of, and that again impacts, going back to that question about loans, about, financial capabilities, that again goes back to that question. In terms of health, I'm not very sure, but financial capabilities are definitely correlated with your, identity, whether that's ethnic identity or racial identity, or even, women versus men.
Oh, in terms of the consumer base, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. I was talking more from the employee side, but yeah, that's also absolutely right. Right. There's one question which I would like to pick up. Maybe we're running out of time, but sometimes diversity cannot guarantee the representation of minority due to less inclusion or consideration of viewpoints. How do you deal with that?
Before we get into the question of dealing with this, I think it's important for us to understand what is diversity, what is equity, what is inclusion. So diversity, it's, David here, me here, somebody with a background in finance or somebody from the northeastern part of India, they're all sitting at the same table. That is diversity, like having a diverse representation. Inclusion refers to, a certain comfort level that you can talk about your views, about your opinions, despite coming from different backgrounds, and you can express yourself freely on that table. That is inclusion. Are you feeling included? And equity ensures that irrespective of your background, you are able to find a seat on that table. So diversity is, equivalent to representation. Inclusion, are you comfortable expressing your viewpoints? And equity is irrespective of your background, can find a seat on that table.
Fantastic. And that adds a lot of value. So I think what we're broadly saying is that a lot of opportunities in this field, and both from the policy side, but also on the research side, a lot needs to be done. And I think organizations are already gearing towards it. They realize it. And I'm sure academics can also contribute to this field. This is a very ripe field, and we all should consciously work in this particular domain. And that's very interesting. So Ratri brings up a very interesting point that there's a call for papers in IGOPM during DEI. I think a lot of opportunities in this particular field. And those who are here and you would like to participate in more CTL activities, we also have a India Management Research Conference coming up in December. It is from 7, 8, 9. So it's also a bit of advertisement for the conference. So do send your best work to the conference. We have a separate track for transportation and logistics. So if you're excited about presenting some of your work, and this may be a golden opportunity to not only visit our campus, but also network with IMA folks and other parts of the world who are joining this conference and expand your horizons, right? So though in general, we are very, very happy with you having here today with us in the evening. We are very excited. So I hope you can physically join us sometime in the campus as well when you visit next time.
I would have loved to attend that conference, but it clashes with my teaching, and these are the last 2 classes of teaching. So yeah, otherwise I'm coming to India in December. I would have.
Oh, okay. We'll miss you very much, but hopefully we can still host you sometime in the future in the campus. Yeah.
Definitely, I would love that.
Yeah. And thank you all for joining in this busy Friday evening. It's always a getting into weekend mode, but still you all could make it. And I'm glad you all could join us for this so important topic for India and the rest of the world. So thank you, Doi, for this webinar, which is very, very nice. And thank you all for joining it. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.